The Kargil War, also known as the Kargil conflict, was an armed conflict between India and Pakistan that took place between May and July 1999 in the Kargil district of Kashmir and elsewhere along the line of control. In India, the conflict is also referred to as Operation Vijay, which was the name of the Indian operation to clear the Kargil sector. The cause of the war was the infiltration of Pakistani soldiers and Kashmiri militants into positions on the Indian side of the loch, which serves as the de facto border between the two states. During the initial stages of the war, Pakistan blamed the fighting entirely on independent Kashmiri insurgents. But documents left behind by casualties and later statements by Pakistan's Prime Minister and Chief of Army Staff showed involvement of Pakistani paramilitary forces, led by General Ashraf Rashid. The Indian Army, later on supported by the Indian Air Force, recaptured a majority of the positions on the Indian side of the loch infiltrated by the Pakistani troops and militants. With international diplomatic opposition, the Pakistani forces withdrew from the remaining Indian positions along the loch. The war is one of the most recent examples of high-altitude warfare in mountainous terrain, which posed significant logistical problems for the combating sides. It is one of the very few instances of direct conventional warfare between nuclear states. India had conducted its first successful test in 1974. Pakistan, which had been developing its nuclear capability in secret since around the same time, conducted its first known tests in 1998, just 2 weeks after a second series of tests by India. Location: before the partition of India in 1947, Kargil was part of the Baltistan district of Ladakh, a sparsely populated region with diverse linguistic, ethnic and religious groups, living in isolated valleys separated by some of the world's highest mountains. The First Kashmir War concluded with the loch bisecting the Baltistan district, with the town and district of Kargil lying on the Indian side and the Ladakh subdivision of the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. After Pakistan's defeat in the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971, the two nations signed the similar agreement promising not to engage in armed conflict with respect to that boundary. The town of Kargil is located 205 kilometers from Srinagar, facing the northern areas across the loch. Like other areas in the Himalayas, Kargil has a temperate climate. Summers are cool with frigid nights, while winters are long and chilly with temperatures often dropping to -48 degrees Celsius. An Indian national highway connecting Srinagar to Leh cuts through Kargil. The area that witnessed the infiltration and fighting is a 160 km long stretch of ridges overlooking this only road linking Srinagar and Leh. The military outposts on the ridges above the highway were generally around 5,000 meters high, with a few as high as 5,485 meters. Apart from the district capital, Kargil, the populated areas near the front line in the conflict included the Mushko Valley and the town of Dras, southwest of Kargil, as well as the Batalik sector and other areas northeast of Kargil. Kargil was targeted partly because the terrain was conducive to the preemptive seizure of several unoccupied military positions, with tactically vital features and well-prepared defensive posts atop the peaks. A defender on the high ground would enjoy advantages akin to a fortress. Any attack to dislodge or defender from high ground in mountain warfare requires a far higher ratio of attackers to defenders, and the difficulties would be exacerbated by the high altitude and freezing temperatures. Kargil is just 173 kilometers from the Pakistani-controlled town of Skardu, which was capable of providing logistical and artillery support to Pakistani combatants. Background: after the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971, There had been a long period with relatively few direct armed conflicts involving the military forces of the two neighbors, notwithstanding the efforts of both nations to control the Siachen Glacier by establishing military outposts on the surrounding mountains ridges and the resulting military skirmishes in the 1980s. During the 1990s, however, escalating tensions and conflict due to separatist activities in Kashmir, some of which were supported by Pakistan, as well as the conducting of nuclear tests by both countries in 1998, led to an increasingly belligerent atmosphere. In an attempt to defuse the situation, both countries signed the Lahore Declaration in February 1999. Promising to provide a peaceful and bilateral solution to the Kashmir conflict. During the winter of 1998–1999, some elements of the Pakistani armed forces were covertly training and sending Pakistani troops and paramilitary forces, some allegedly in the guise of mujahideen, into territory on the Indian side of the loch. The infiltration was codenamed Operation Badr. Its aim was to sever the link between Kashmir and Ladakh, and cause Indian forces to withdraw from the Siachen Glacier, thus forcing India to negotiate a settlement of the broader Kashmir dispute. Pakistan also believed that any tension in the region would internationalize the Kashmir issue, helping it to secure a speedy resolution. Yet another goal may have been to boost the morale of the decade-long rebellion in Indian-administered Kashmir by taking a proactive role. Pakistani Lieutenant General Shahid Aziz, and then head of ISI Analysis Wing, has confirmed there were no mujahideen but only regular Pakistan Army soldiers who took part in the Kargil War. There were no mujahideen, only taped wireless messages, which fooled no one. Our soldiers were made to occupy barren ridges, with handheld weapons and ammunition, Lt Gen Aziz wrote in his article in The Nation Daily in January 2013. Some writers have speculated that the operation's objective may also have been retaliation for India's Operation Meghdoot in 1984 that seized much of Siachen Glacier. According to India's then Army Chief Aide Prakash Malik, and many other scholars, much of the background planning, including construction of logistical supply routes, had been undertaken much earlier. On several occasions during the 1980s and 1990s, the army had given Pakistani leaders similar proposals for infiltration into the Kargil region, but the plans had been shelved for fear of drawing the nations into all-out war. Some analysts believed that the blueprint of attack was reactivated soon after Pervez Musharraf was appointed Chief of Army Staff in October 1998. After the war, Nawaz Sharif, Prime Minister of Pakistan during the Kargil conflict, claimed that he was unaware of the plans, and that he first learned about the situation when he received an urgent phone call from Atal Bihari Vajpayee, his counterpart in India. Sharif attributed the plan to Musharraf and just 2 or 3 of his cronies, a view shared by some Pakistani writers who have stated that only 4 generals, including Musharraf, knew of the plan. Musharraf, however, asserted that Sharif had been briefed on the Kargil operation 15 days ahead of Vajpayee's journey to Lahore on February 20. War progress. Conflict events. There were 3 major phases to the Kargil War. First, Pakistan infiltrated forces into the Indian-controlled section of Kashmir and occupied strategic locations, enabling it to bring NH-1 within range of its artillery fire. The next stage consisted of India discovering the infiltration and mobilizing forces to respond to it. The final stage involved major battles by Indian and Pakistani forces, resulting in India recapturing some territory held by Pakistani forces and the Subsequent withdrawal of Pakistani forces back across the line of control after international pressure. Occupation by Pakistan during the winter season, due to extreme cold in the snow-capped mountainous areas of Kashmir. It was a common practice for both the Indian and Pakistan armies to abandon some forward posts on their respective sides of the lock-in to reduce patrolling of areas that may be avenues of infiltration. When weather conditions became less severe, forward posts would be reoccupied and patrolling resumed. During February 1999, the Pakistan Army began to reoccupy the posts it had abandoned on its side of the lock in the Kargil region, but also sent forces to occupy some posts on the Indian side of the lock. Troops from the Elite Special Services Group as well as 4 to 7 battalions of the Northern Light Infantry covertly and overtly set up bases on the vantage points of the Indian-controlled region. According to some reports, these Pakistani forces were backed by Kashmiri guerrillas and Afghan mercenaries. Pakistani intrusions took place in the heights of the lower Mushko Valley, along the Marpola ridgeline in Dras, in Kaksar near Kargil, in the Batalik sector east of the Indus River, on the heights above of the Chorbatla sector where the lock turns north, and in the Turtok sector south of the Siachen area. India discovers infiltration and mobilizes initially. These incursions were not detected for a number of reasons. Indian patrols were not sent into some of the areas infiltrated by the Pakistani forces, and heavy artillery fire by Pakistan in some areas provided cover for the infiltrators. But by the second week of May, the ambushing of an Indian patrol team led by Captain Saurabh Kalia, who acted on a tip-off by a local shepherd in the Batalik sector, led to the exposure of the infiltration. Initially, with little knowledge of the nature or extent of the infiltration, the Indian troops in the area assumed that the infiltrators were jihadists and claimed that they would evict them within a few days. Subsequent discovery of infiltration elsewhere along the lock, and the difference in tactics employed by the infiltrators, caused the Indian Army to realize that the plan of attack was on a much bigger scale. The total area seized by the ingress is generally accepted to between 130 square kilometers to 200 square kilometers. The Government of India responded with Operation Vijay, a mobilization of 200,000 Indian troops. However, because of the nature of the terrain, division and corps operations could not be mounted. Subsequent fighting was conducted mostly at the regimental or battalion level. In effect, 2 divisions of the Indian Army, numbering 20,000, plus several thousand from the paramilitary forces of India and the Air Force, were deployed in the conflict zone. The total number of Indian soldiers that were involved in the military operation on the Kargil-Dras sector was thus close to 30,000. The number of infiltrators, including those providing logistical backup, has been put at approximately 5,000 at the height of the conflict. This figure includes troops from Pakistan-administered Kashmir who provided additional artillery support. The Indian Air Force launched Operation Safe Sagar in support of the mobilization of Indian land forces, but its effectiveness during the war was limited by the high altitude and weather conditions, which in turn limited bomb loads and the number of airstrips that could be used. Naval Action. The Indian Navy also prepared to blockade the Pakistani ports to cut off supply routes under Operation Talwar. This exploited Pakistan's dependence on sea-based oil and trade flows. Later, then Prime Minister of Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif, disclosed that Pakistan was left with just 6 days of fuel to sustain itself if a full-scale war had broken out. India attacks Pakistani positions. The terrain of Kashmir is mountainous and at high altitudes. Even the best roads, such as National Highway 1D from Leh to Srinagar, are only 2 lanes. The rough terrain and narrow roads slowed down traffic, and the high altitude, which affected the ability of aircraft to carry loads, made control of NH-1D a priority for India. From their observation posts, the Pakistani forces had a clear line of sight to lay down indirect artillery fire on NH-1D, inflicting heavy casualties on the Indians. This was a serious problem for the Indian Army as the highway was the main logistical and supply route. The Pakistani shelling of the arterial road posed the threat of Leh being cut off, though an alternative road to Leh existed via Himachal Pradesh. The infiltrators, apart from being equipped with small arms and grenade launchers, were also armed with mortars, artillery and anti-aircraft guns. Many posts were also heavily mined, with India later stating to have recovered more than 8,000 anti-personnel mines according to an ICBL report. Pakistan's reconnaissance was done through unmanned aerial vehicles and TPQ-36 Firefinder radars supplied by the US. The initial Indian attacks were aimed at controlling the hills overlooking NH-1D, with high priority being given to the stretches of the highway near the town of Kargil. The majority of posts along the line of control were adjacent to the highway, and therefore the recapture of nearly every infiltrated post increased both the territorial gains and the security of the highway. The protection of this route and the recapture of the forward posts were thus ongoing objectives throughout the war. The Indian Army's first priority was to recapture peaks that were in the immediate vicinity of NH-1D. This resulted in Indian troops first targeting the Tiger Hill and Tolaling complex in Dras, which dominated the Srinagar-Leh route. This was soon followed by the Batalik-Turtok subsector, which provided access to Siachen Glacier. Some of the peaks that were of vital strategic importance to the Pakistani defensive troops were Point 4590 and Point 5353, while 4590 was the nearest point that had a view of NH-1D. Point 5353 was the highest feature in the Dras sector, allowing the Pakistani troops to observe NH-1D. The recapture of Point 4590 by Indian troops on June 14 was significant, notwithstanding the fact that it resulted in the Indian Army suffering the most casualties in a single battle during the conflict. Though most of the posts in the vicinity of the highway were cleared by mid-June, some parts of the highway near Dras witnessed sporadic shelling until the end of the war. Once India regained control of the hills overlooking NH-1D, the Indian Army turned to driving the invading force back across the line of control. The Battle of Tolaling, among other assaults, slowly tilted the combat in India's favour. The Pakistani troops at Tolaling were aided by Pakistani fighters from Kashmir. Some of the posts put up a stiff resistance, including Tiger Hill, that fell only later in the war. Indian troops found well-entrenched Pakistani soldiers at Tiger Hill, and both sides suffered heavy casualties. After a final assault on the peak in which 10 Pakistani soldiers and 5 Indian soldiers were killed, Tiger Hill finally fell. A few of the assaults occurred atop hitherto unheard-of peaks, most of them unnamed with only point numbers to differentiate them, which witnessed fierce hand-to-hand combat. As the operation was fully underway, about 250 artillery guns were brought in to clear the infiltrators in the posts that were in the line of sight. The Bofors FH-77B field howitzer played a vital role, with Indian gunners making maximum use of the terrain that assisted such an attack. However, its success was limited elsewhere due to the lack of space and depth to deploy the Bofors gun. It was in this type of terrain that aerial attacks were used with limited effectiveness. French-made Mirage 2000H of the IAF were tasked to drop laser-guided bombs to destroy well-entrenched positions of the Pakistani forces. However, the IAF lost a MiG-27 strike aircraft which it attributed to an engine failure, as well as a MiG-21 fighter which was shot down by Pakistan. Initially, Pakistan said it shot down both jets after they crossed into its territory. One Mi-8 helicopter was also lost, due to Stinger SAMs. On May 27, 1999, FLT Nachiketa developed engine trouble in the Batalik sector and bailed out of his craft. Squadron LDR Ahuja went out of his way to locate his comrade but was shot down by a shoulder-fired Stinger missile. According to reports, he had bailed out of his stricken plane safely but was apparently killed by his captors as his body was returned riddled with bullet wounds. In many vital points, neither artillery nor air power could dislodge the outposts manned by the Pakistani soldiers, who were out of visible range. The Indian Army mounted some direct frontal ground assaults which were slow and took a heavy toll given the steep ascent that had to be made on peaks as high as 18,000 feet. Since any daylight attack would be suicidal, all the advances had to be made under the cover of darkness, escalating the risk of freezing. Accounting for the wind chill factor, the temperatures were often as low as -15 degrees Celsius to -11 degrees Celsius near the mountain tops. Based on military tactics, much of the costly frontal assaults by the Indians could have been avoided if the Indian military had chosen to blockade the supply route of the opposing force, virtually creating a siege. Such a move would have involved the Indian troops crossing the loch as well as initiating aerial attacks on Pakistan soil, a maneuver India was not willing to exercise, fearing an expansion of the theatre of war and reducing international support for its cause. 2 months into the conflict, Indian troops had slowly retaken most of the ridges that were encroached by the infiltrators. According to official count, an estimated 75% to 80% of the intruded area and nearly all high ground were back under Indian control. Withdrawal and final battles following the outbreak of armed fighting, Pakistan sought American help in de-escalating the conflict. Bruce Riedel, who was then an aide to President Bill Clinton, reported that U.S. intelligence had imaged Pakistani movements of nuclear weapons to forward deployments for fear of the Kargil hostilities escalating into a wider conflict. However, President Clinton refused to intervene until Pakistan had removed all forces from the Indian side of the line of control. Following the Washington Accord of July 4, 1999, when Sharif agreed to withdraw Pakistani troops, most of the fighting came to a gradual halt. But some Pakistani forces remained in positions on the Indian side of the loch. In addition, the United Jihad Council rejected Pakistan's plan for a climb down, instead deciding to fight on. The Indian Army launched its final attacks in the last week of July, as soon as the Dras subsector had been cleared of Pakistani forces. The fighting ceased on July 26. The day has since been marked as Kargil War in India. By the end of the war, Pakistan had to withdraw under international pressure and due to pressure from continued fighting at battlefront, and left India in control of all territory south and east of the line of control, as was established in July 1972 as per the Simla Agreement.